Wrestling builds a promise out of characters. On Monday you meet them, by the weekend you've chosen sides. The trick is in how close the show can lean toward real without breaking it. Bodies take real falls. Emotions get real when the room is quiet and the crowd has gone home. The men and women who carry those stories through airports and hotel elevators still have houses somewhere, still have families waiting on a call. The distance between the ring and the living room is not far, but it matters. It's where the noise fades and the routine starts over. Every so often that line blurs in a way nobody planned. A cue gets replaced by a rumor that feels heavier than anything written on a whiteboard in a writer's room brainstorm. Somewhere there is a superstar wrestling on NBC pay-per-view until he's not. In a business that depends on certainty, even a small break can pull the whole narrative out of shape. This episode steps into that space. It's about an era when the work felt clean and believable, and about the private lives that ran beside it. It's about a family most viewers knew only from a hallway shot and a wave, and a friendship that existed in the long drives between towns. It's about the show that kept moving and the weekend that did not. To make sense of what was seen on television and what was found at home, we have to sit with both. We have to remember what the camera showed and ask what they couldn't. We have to go behind the headlines. This is the story of WWE superstar Chris Benoit. Chris Benoit was born May 21st, 1967, in Montreal, Canada, and by the mid-1980s, he was already moving toward the only thing that seemed to make sense to him. He began wrestling in 1985, entering a pipeline that favored repetition over flash and rewarded persistence more than noise. The ring names he carried over the years tell the story of how fans saw him and how promoters sold him. The Canadian Crippler, the Rabid Wolverine, and the Pegasus Kid. None of those names leaned on comedy or spectacle. They promised intensity, stamina, and a believable fight, which is exactly what he offered when the bell rang. The first major milestone Chris garnered came in Japan. As the Pegasus Kid, Benoit captured the WGP Junior Heavyweight Championship in 1990, a title that really mattered because of who held it and where it was won. In that era, New Japan's Junior Heavyweight division set the standard for speed and precision, and getting to the top of that mountain meant you could run with anyone. That reign didn't just mark him as a traveler, it marked him as a worker respected by the best in a country that demanded crisp execution over theatrics. He kept moving as wrestlers do, taking the same toolkit around the world, including tours in Australia years later when WWE brought a stadium show to Melbourne and put its top names on the card. The geography changed, the logos changed, but the match people expected from him did not. Benoit's first WCW stint came in 1992, a waypoint that would preview his longer, more defining run with the company later in the decade. He bounced through the usual stops of that era: Japan, independent dates, Extreme Championship Wrestling, and then returned to WCW in 1995, settling in a roster stacked with established veteran wrestlers and new arrivals trying to get their big break. It was in that period that the Crippler branding took hold and WCW leaned into the Canadian Crippler, a label that matched how people already talked about his matches: snug offense, relentless pacing, and finishes that felt earned rather than choreographed. Wrestling columnist Mike Mooneyham put the respect that surrounded Chris into plain language years later. He was believable, realistic, and probably one of the greatest workers over the last 10 or 15 years. If it was a bad show, Chris could save it in his match. That wasn't hype so much as consensus. The next chapter made him a household name in the wrestling world. He moved to WWE in 2000, and after grinding through injuries, brand splits, and the constant churn of television, climbed into the exact spot most wrestlers dream of. In March 2004, at WrestleMania 20 in Madison Square Garden, Benoit won the World Heavyweight Championship in a triple threat main event. His finish that night was clean, decisive, and impossible to argue with. It cemented him as a top dog to anyone who still hesitated to put him in that category. In a career where the checklist is both public and unforgiving, the box next to World Champion was finally ticked, and the title run validated the years he had spent building credibility, one match at a time. Across all of it, the personal notes people hit when they described him were consistent and kind. No one ever seemed to have anything bad to say about Chris in the locker room. They called him a hard worker, loyal, polite, quiet, but passionate about his career. Someone added that he rarely showed emotion, that he kept to himself and didn't wear his heart on his sleeve. None of that meant distance from the audience. It meant he trusted the mat to do the talking. His style wasn't gimmicky. It was as true as the form allowed, a throwback to an old-school sensibility that prioritized holds, counters, and clean execution over shortcuts. That approach made him the person producers leaned on when they needed a segment repaired, and the person fans highlighted when they wanted to show someone what a good match looks like. He held 30 wrestling championships over the course of his career, a number that underlines how often promoters handed him the responsibility that comes with a belt and how often he justified that trust by delivering when it counted. In a business built on characters, the character he chose was simple: a wrestler whose best argument was the next match. From Montreal to Tokyo to Melbourne to television main events in New York City, Chris kept his head high. He started in 1985 with a narrow focus, and by 2004 reached the top of the industry without changing the core of what he did or what he believed in. The nicknames and the trophies told part of it, but colleagues remembered his sheer passion for his craft. That foundation carried him quietly from one locker room to the next and set the stage for what came after. While he was building that reputation, another story was taking shape on a parallel track. It begins in Florida with Nancy, a teenager who wanted a home and a steady life, and who would be pulled from the crowd in Orlando into a role viewers came to know as woman. To see how their paths finally crossed, we have to start with Nancy's beginning. All that Nancy had ever wanted, by the accounts closest to her, was to be a housewife. That expectation shaped the first big decision she made as a teenager. Before she ever became Chris Benoit's wife, she married her high school sweetheart, Jim Doss. She dropped out of high school in Florida to do it, trading a cap and gown for a marriage license and the kind of domestic future she thought would fit. From there, Nancy moved up in the wrestling world fast. She became a recognizable presence, a big name in WWE, a face on magazine covers, and a figure threaded into the storylines that kept the shows moving and the audience on the edge of their seats. She joined the entourage of Kevin Sullivan, a veteran wrestler whose ring persona leaned dark and hit the road dressed in leather and chains. It was a character people remembered, and it sold the stories she was placed in. For a while, Doss went along with it. He traveled where he could and tried to fit into the schedule, and kept pace with the long drives that connected one arena to the next. But tour buses are cramped, spots are limited, and eventually, there wasn't room for him anymore. The distance between the life they started and the life they were living wasn't just geographic. It was in what each of them wanted the future to look like. On New Year's Day, after he picked her up from the airport, Doss said what both of them likely knew. He suggested they divorce. The relationship was headed in vastly different directions, and he didn't see a way to rein it back in without hurting himself or Nancy. Within days, they were sitting with the same lawyer, working through the ending together. Doss later remembered it sadly. "We cried a lot that day. It was very hard on me. That was the toughest year of my life, the year I got divorced." After the split, he walked away from the thing that had pulled Nancy in. He stopped watching wrestling altogether. Nancy did the opposite. Her career kept climbing. The stage lights were brighter, the angles bigger, and her ties inside the business deeper. Soon enough, she was in love with the very wrestler whose entourage she joined. Kevin Sullivan's reputation in the ring was that of a Satan of wrestling, a nickname earned by the style, the demeanor, and the stories he told on television. However, Doss may have a different opinion on whether the nickname has some truth to it. Off camera, he and Nancy built a life together. By the mid-1990s, the relationship between Kevin and Nancy was showing strain. It was rumored that Sullivan was a physically abusive husband, a rumor that followed them from town to town and colored how people read the tension between appearances. Nancy was still working, still visible, still known by the stage name that stuck, Woman. She could play the role that cameras needed and make a segment work with a look or a cue. But wrestlers' lines between fiction and reality are notoriously thin, and the next turn in her personal story came from a script Kevin wrote himself. He put a storyline on television that had Nancy and Chris Benoit being sweet on each other. It was supposed to live in the ring, an angle to build heat and raise the stakes. Only that storyline didn't stay within four corners of the ring. Colleagues recalled that when Kevin Sullivan allegedly got too rough, Nancy would call Chris for help, a private signal that said more than any on-screen storyline could. It was rumored that Kevin Sullivan was a well-known domestic abuser. Kevin and Nancy split. She chose Chris. She and Chris quickly married and welcomed their son, Daniel. With that decision, she stepped away from that career, the one that had made her recognizable, and chose to be a stay-at-home mom. Chris stayed on the road and remained an influential figure in the wrestling world, the kind of performer promoters trusted and audiences respected. Nancy appeared at his matches here and there, present in the hallway shots and the family celebrations that followed a win, often with little Daniel on her hip. They showed a family stitched together by the same business that had introduced them, standing just off camera until the spotlight found them for a beat. On television, the couple looked nearly perfect. Their segments were clean, their public appearances practiced, and the rare glimpses of home life were framed as a reward for the audience. Behind closed doors may have been a different story. In 2003, Nancy petitioned for divorce. A few months later, she withdrew the request. In that same stretch of time, she filed for a temporary protection order from domestic abuse, a move that suggests escalating tension and a desire for space, but she later dropped that as well. The filings exist as formal markers, but they do not explain anything. No one could really know what was truly going on in the Benoit household. From the perspective of Nancy's family, none of this alleged turmoil was visible. Her parents said they had no reason to believe anything was wrong in their Fayetteville, Georgia property, a spread of 8.6 acres that radiated peace. Through their attorney, they placed their understanding of the household into clear language. They had a normal son-in-law relationship with Chris. They didn't treat him as a superstar, and he didn't want to be treated as a superstar. He took out the trash, and they treated him as anyone would treat a son-in-law. The couple had a close and loving relationship as far as they knew. That is the portrait they carried. A day-to-day routine with chores and small talk, and none of the drama that finds its way onto a television show. It's also the portrait they chose to carry today, despite the tragedies to come. There were also reports that Nancy and Chris had been arguing over the care of Daniel in the early mid-2000s. Those reports centered on a claim that Daniel had Fragile X syndrome. The condition itself is a genetic disorder known to cause intellectual disability, developmental delays, and behavioral problems. It is the kind of diagnosis that can reshape a family's schedule and their expectations. In this case, the reported ailment was not known or documented by anyone. It appeared in rumor and speculation but did not carry medical information. What is visible and not in dispute is the way Daniel oriented his world around his father. At 7 years old, he had posters of Chris all over his room and toy wrestling belts within easy reach. The hero he saw on television was the same person who tucked him in at night. By every description, Daniel adored his dad. The balance they were trying to keep at home met a different kind of weight on the road. In that tight circle of wrestlers, Chris's closest bond was with Eddie Guerrero, a friend he trusted in green rooms and long bus rides and flights when the lights were off, and all you could hear was the whir of the engine. When Eddie died, the loss did not keep its distance. It cut through Chris's routine, and the quiet rules he lived by, and the man who had never worn his heart on his sleeve was suddenly carrying the emotion that he couldn't hide. What followed for him begins with that day, and with the way Eddie's absence changed everything. Eddie Guerrero and Chris were both wrestlers, shaped by the same routines and the same need to deliver when the cameras flashed red. What grew between them over the years on the road was an unbreakable bond that looked less like a friendship and more like family. Eddie's life was marked by a struggle he faced in full view of the people closest to him. He battled with substance abuse and survived more than one overdose. On his third, he made the decision to get clean. That turning point mattered to the people around him because it signaled a change in his daily choices and a commitment to stability. Friends, especially Chris, saw the effort it took to stay sober inside an industry that revolves around sex, money, and drugs. In 2005, when Eddie was only 38, he died of heart failure in a Minnesota hotel room. For Chris, that loss crept into his heart and never let go. He was known for keeping his feelings close, rarely showing what a match cost him or how the road wore him down. Eddie's absence, his death, changed that forever.
I couldn't find the words. Words couldn't describe what kind of a human being Eddie truly was. He was the one friend that I had that I could go to and pour my heart out to if I was going through something, if I had a personal issue or a personal problem. He was the one guy that I could call and talk to and know that he would understand and he would talk me out of it. And I want you to know that I love you. I miss you.
In the weeks and months after Eddie's passing, Chris turned to writing. Nancy gifted her husband a journal that he could work through his grief in, and he kept entries that read like letters to Eddie, not summaries of his days, but conversations aimed at someone who was no longer there to answer. He wrote as if Eddie could still hear him, as if putting the words down could bridge a distance that felt impossible to bear. The entries did more than record grief. They revealed how deeply he was struggling with the loss. According to Chris's father, the writing was disturbing in its intensity and content, a sign that the unexpected death had unsettled Chris in ways he could not easily express out loud. The pages suggested a man searching for a shape to his grief and finding only more of it. One line stood out for what it declared about his state of mind. At one point, Chris wrote, "I will be with you soon." Taken alongside the rest of the journal, the sentence reads like a promise made in despair. It points to a very depressive state, the kind of thinking that narrows options and interprets absence as a call. The effect of Eddie's death lingered in Chris. People who had long described Chris as polite, loyal, and self-contained now saw a more visible strain. In a business that depends on predictability, call times, cues, and finishes, Eddie's absence ripped that predictability away from Chris. On Friday, June 22, 2007, Chris never faltered from his routine. He saw his physician and friend, Dr. Phil Astin, and then he got in the car and made the 2-hour drive to Carrollton, Georgia. Somewhere along that route, a fan asked for a photo. Chris stopped, leaned in, and smiled wide, something most celebrities would hesitate to do today. The weekend ahead looked routine. He had flights lined up and a spot on the marquee in Texas, the kind of travel that he had made second nature after years on the road as a pro wrestler. Saturday's assignment was Beaumont, Texas, June 23rd. According to WWE officials, Chris reached out and he said he wouldn't be able to make the show because his wife and son were ill. The officials adjusted quickly. They understood that life happens and family comes first. They rebooked his flight for early the next morning so he could still work the pay-per-view in Houston on Sunday. Throughout the day, employees tried to confirm with Chris his revised travel plans. However, all day, no one could get a hold of him. Just before 4 a.m. on Sunday, June 24th, a string of odd text messages went from Chris to a couple of his coworkers. The first read, "My physical address is 130 Green Meadow Lane, Fayetteville, Georgia, 30215. The second text followed with a specific detail, granting the recipients of the text entry to the house. "The dogs are in the enclosed pool area. Garage side door is open." Then the address came again, slightly reformatted, more staccato. "My physical address is 130 Green Meadow Lane, Fayetteville, Georgia, 30215. Messages 4 and 5 repeated that exact same wording. In total, the address appeared 4 times. The note about the dogs and the open side door appeared once. There was nothing else attached to those texts, but they made it clear that something was off. All day Sunday, as the Houston show drew closer, WWE kept trying to reach him. He hadn't gotten on his flight and surely wasn't in Houston. They called his phone, Nancy's, nothing. They checked hospitals in the Atlanta area, but each attempt came up empty. No return call, no airport check-in, no quick text to clear things up. What they had were these cryptic, odd messages. On Monday, June 25th at about 12:30 p.m., officials at WWE were formally notified of the overnight texts. They contacted the Fayetteville Police Department and asked for a welfare check at 130 Green Meadow Lane. The sheriff's office called back after entering the residence, reporting what can only be described as a tragedy. Inside the Benoit's Fayetteville, Georgia home, they found 3 bodies: an adult male, an adult female, and a male child. Chris, Nancy, and little Daniel, only 7 years old. The live event scheduled that night in Corpus Christi was canceled. In its place, the company aired a memorial dedicated to Chris and announced his passing to the viewers. It was the immediate response to the news as it first arrived. A pause in regular programming for a performer who, as far as the public knew that evening, had died suddenly. As law enforcement set the timeline inside the house, the order became clear by date. Nancy had been killed on Friday, June 22nd. Her wrists and feet were bound, and she was strangled with a cord. On Saturday, June 23rd, Daniel was killed. He was placed in a chokehold by his own father and strangled. On Sunday, June 24th, Chris died by suicide in his home gym, hanging himself with a cable from a workout machine, the weights situated to hold his body up. In the rooms where Nancy and Daniel were found, Bibles had been intently placed next to their corpses. Rigor mortis had already set in for Nancy, showing she had been dead for a few days. Her skin was marbleizing, and she had been lying on the ground, face down. The welfare check that brought officers there had been requested because Chris had not shown up for his WWE event on Sunday, June 24th, as planned. And that wasn't like him. Outside of the home and on the television, the first announcements collided with an audience trained to expect twists. The June 25th episode of Monday Night Raw had been set to lean into a storyline about the WWE chairman's limousine exploding on television a few weeks earlier. When viewers were told instead that Chris had died, many assumed it was another angle, not a real loss, purely fictitious, part of the soap. The confusion showed up in phones and inboxes. As columnist Mike Mooneyham put it, "I probably had 50 or 60 messages Monday, and most of them weren't convinced." That line between fact and fiction is so blurred that fans don't even know. Inside the company, the information was also partial. At that point, they only knew that Chris, Nancy, and Daniel were gone. They memorialized him that night, unaware of what the investigation would reveal in the hours and days ahead. Investigators moved quickly through the possibilities. An outside homicide was briefly considered, then set aside. The conclusion, based on what they found and in what order they found it, was that Chris acted alone. As that determination took shape, attention widened to the question of what might have been in his system. In the days after the murder-suicide, federal agents raided the office of Dr. Phil Astin, a friend of Chris's, and the physician he had paid a visit to on Friday, to secure records and see what prescriptions had been written and when. Many people believed he was taking performance enhancers. To some, it seemed obvious just by looking at him. Claims quickly rose that Dr. Astin had illegally prescribed drugs and caused Chris to strangle Nancy and smother Daniel, and investigators wanted documents that could confirm or refute those claims. The toxicology results gave specifics instead of guesses. Chris was found to have had abnormally high levels of testosterone at the time of his death, about 10 times the normal amount for an adult male. During the autopsy, he tested positive for an anabolic steroid and a couple of other drugs you wouldn't expect from an athlete. Xanax was heavily present in his system, and so was hydrocodone, an opioid painkiller. The state medical examiner deduced that the steroid had been injected shortly before he died, but investigators were confused when alcohol was not part of his panel. He tested negative, even though investigators noted 10 empty beer cans in the home and an empty bottle of wine only a few feet from where he hanged himself in the gym. Daniel's results told a quieter story with the same kind of weight. He had been sedated, likely by his father. And it makes you wonder if, in his state, Chris knew what he was doing and how horrendous it was, and wanted Daniel to be asleep, a small kindness within a larger evil. He tested positive for what is considered a therapeutic amount of Xanax. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation could not test for steroids in Daniel because there was not enough urine to run that portion of the screen. But it seems as if investigators considered that Chris had injected his son with the same performance enhancers he had been using on himself. Nancy's tox screen showed the most substances. Maybe it was because she was the first victim to fall to her husband. She tested positive for Xanax, hydrocodone, and hydromorphone. Her blood alcohol level registered at 0.184. The legal limit used to deem someone drunk, or rather too intoxicated to operate a vehicle, is 0.08. But the report also included a caution that decomposition can affect that number, a reminder that chemistry continues after death and can push readings higher than what they were in life. Taken alongside her position on the floor and the signs of time past, the numbers added detail to what officers already suspected about when she died and what was present in her body at the time. The paperwork coming out of Dr. Astin's office added a pattern to those single results. It was reported that every 3 to 4 weeks, he prescribed Chris a 10-month supply of anabolic steroids, and that this cycle continued for upwards of a year before the killings. The volume of those prescriptions stood out. It suggested access and frequency well beyond ordinary treatment. In January 2009, Astin pleaded guilty to illegally dispensing drugs, specifically painkillers. He also admitted to doing the same for 2 other unnamed patients. The plea did not tie a legal knot around what happened inside the house on Green Meadow Lane, but it did establish that the flow of medication connected to Chris was not just heavy, it was unlawful. As the findings settled and the company's first response shifted, once WWE learned what Chris had done, they removed any and all memorials to him on air and from their website. The tribute that had aired Monday night was pulled from rotation, replaced by statements calibrated to the facts that investigators had documented inside the home. What aired in those first hours reflected what was known then. What remained afterward reflected what the case had shown. An outside homicide was considered and quickly dismissed. The conclusion that he acted alone remained. Chris Benoit had taken the lives of his wife, his 7-year-old son, and himself. What they could not pull from a toxicology report or a scene photo was the answer that would linger in everyone's mind. Why did he do it? The first answers people reached for were emotional, not clinical. One of Chris's friends voiced what everyone was thinking. Do I still love this guy? Or do I walk away hating this guy who's so out there that he could actually kill his wife and son? It's hard to distinguish, and you can't meet them both halfway. And that's where the why starts, in rooms that knew him, with shock that refuses to sort itself. Outside those rooms, the public reaction split along familiar lines. Some blamed drugs before the lab results were even dry. Others pointed to the grind of head trauma the business demands and asked what a brain absorbs after years of chair shots, missed cues, and the kind of matches that sell realism by letting it land. The medical work that followed moved the conversation from speculation to true brain tissue. Neurologists examined Chris's brain after his death and found widespread evidence of chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or CTE, a progressive disease linked to repeated head impacts. Doctors affiliated with the Sports Legacy Institute reported changes severe enough to mirror advanced dementia in much older patients, and they argued that repeated concussions could have contributed to what happened in his house. Julian Bales, then chair of neurosurgery at West Virginia University, summarized the findings in plain language. The damage was extensive and could very likely explain aberrant behavior, including suicide and even homicide. Those statements landed next to a competing narrative about steroids. Toxicology screens found elevated synthetic testosterone along with other drugs in Chris's system, and investigators noted that a steroid injection likely occurred shortly before his death. The presence of testosterone fed the idea of so-called roid rage, a popular shorthand for steroid-fueled violence that had been circulating the headlines for decades. But when pressed on whether that framework fit the evidence, Bales cautioned against it. He said there was no medical consensus that roid rage even exists as a defined syndrome, and he all but ruled out steroids as the root cause of what happened in the Fayetteville home. The emphasis from his vantage point was on the trauma mapped across the brain rather than the hormones in his bloodstream. Chris's father, Michael, put the point in terms anyone watching a television brawl could understand. He granted permission for the CTE testing and later said what the pictures and lab reports suggested. The human skull just isn't built to get hit with a table or a chair. He was not assigning a single cause so much as naming the cumulative toll of a performance style that blurred show and impact. It was a simple sentence with a lot inside it, spoken by a parent trying to square a son he knew with acts he could not recognize. Grief and mental health also sat in the background, not as an excuse but as part of the picture of who Chris had become by 2007. After Eddie Guerrero died in 2005, Chris began keeping journal entries written to his friend. Letters that read like one side of a conversation that could no longer happen. According to the attorney for Chris's father, those pages showed a man preoccupied with death and weighed down by loss. In one entry, he wrote, "I will be with you soon," a sentence that, taken with the rest, suggested a depressive state that felt immediate and inescapable to him. Family members later described the writings as disturbing, not in their language, but in what the language revealed about how far he had slipped. ESPN and ABC summarized the doctor's conclusions for a national audience, noting that the pattern of damage matched what researchers had seen in other contact sport cases, and that the severity could account for dramatic changes in mood, judgment, and behavior. The idea wasn't to simplify a day inside a house into a single line of causation. It was to say that the organ that governs thinking and restraint showed clear disease, and that disease had been scientifically tied to depression, dementia, and erratic decision-making. What stays unresolved is how those elements interacted. The lab says testosterone was present at an unusually high level, yet experts closest to the brain findings urge people to look first at trauma rather than at a disputed construct like roid rage. The diaries tell us grief for Eddie didn't fade with time, and that it pressed in hard enough for Chris to talk openly on paper about joining him. Family testimony adds that this was not a man who wore emotion on his sleeve until he could not hide it anymore. The medicine provides a framework, the writing supplies a window, and the father's sentence about skulls and chairs give the context of an industry that sometimes asked its workers to be believable at the expense of being whole. This story feels just like that, a story, but it's a raw depiction of life, a family, a friend, a locker room full of people who thought they knew the man beside them. The headlines are simple, the lives inside them were not. We do not excuse what happened in that house. There's no version of the story that lessens the loss of Nancy and Daniel. What we are trying to do is understand how a person who built a career on discipline and control reached a weekend that broke both. That work does not ask for absolution. It asks for clarity. If you felt anger while listening, that makes sense. Anger shows that you care that two people should still be here. But stopping at hate leaves the larger truth untouched. The science tells us what repeated head trauma can do to a brain. The journals tell us what grief can do to a person who does not say much out loud. The prescriptions and the lab reports add weight without resolving motive. None of those threads ease responsibility. Together, they explain how someone we thought we knew could change in ways that were dangerous to everyone around him. That's not a defense, it's a warning. So as we close this episode, try to hold two things at once. Remember Nancy and Daniel and keep them at the center. Then widen the frame and look at the risks that come with contact sports, especially when the line between performance and damage is crossed. One chair shot, one concussion, too many emotions held in. Ask what safeguards exist and whether they are enough. Support research. Support the people who speak up when something feels off. We all love a good story in the ring. The cost of telling it should never be a family. This has been Joshua John with Behind the Headlines, and until next time, stay safe.